My patient cried and said, "There's nobody on this planet who loves me anymore." I cried when I left because I knew she was right. For context, she was 95, her husband and son had died, she had a personality disorder that made her behavior unbearable for her environment after her husband died, and every person still in her life were paid for to be around her. She died a few months after this conversation. That's heartbreaking. Scary to think of living so long that there's just no point anymore. I had a great aunt who lived to 106. She was around to see her daughter die of old age. She said, "I don't know why the Lord wanted me to live so long." I cried in a substance treatment group. A client's mom had reached out via email to me to say that her daughter died from an OD. She called during my group, so I chose to take the call and spoke with her briefly. I thought I could continue with the group. Ended up in tears instead. The work you're doing is important. My mom and brother would not be around if not for people like you. Focus on the lives saved and keep up the good work. I appreciate you. Had a sweet little boy tell me about the death of his dad, who was his little league coach, tragically died the week of the big championship game. He went ahead and played the game the day before the funeral. He hit a home run and shared tearfully how the next day, he put the baseball in his dad's coffin at the funeral, with his team all standing around him in support. Hell, now I'm crying again. I'm crying too, that is so heartbreaking. And I'm sure his dad is so incredibly proud of him. I was doing a cognitive assessment for a girl. We were doing tests and at one point she started crying. She was unable to tell me why. She was fine just one moment before. I let her collect her thoughts, then she said softly, "I don't want to be more stupid than my friends." She wasn't actually, she was very bright, but she didn't know that she has dyslexia, dysorthography and dyscalculia. I realized that she went through 13 years of school without help. Her parents didn't want to do an assessment as they thought she was just lazy. I told her that she was very brave to decide to get help and things would get better after our assessment, and I felt tears in my eyes. This is horrible of the parents. And is she doing well? I cried when I had to say goodbye to a client of mine who was dying in hospital. We had worked through some pretty challenging things together and he had a huge impact on me, and I felt it was important for him to see that in my tears and words as I said goodbye. I feel like crying reading this. I was sitting with someone struggling with alcohol, who couldn't get clean. At the same time, my very best friend in the entire world was dying because of alcohol. I couldn't get to him because it was the beginning of COVID and it was tearing me up. But I went to work anyway, which was fine except for this one person. I had to stop the session, explain a bit, and then went back to her. The grief just sort of caught me off guard. I read your username terribly wrong. Not during the session, but I wanted to. I had a teenage client who asked me to listen to their life story, part of the 12-step program they were in. They didn't want me to correct the grammar, just to tell them if it made sense. It started off with, "The first time I did drugs I was 9 years old when my mom and her boyfriend injected me with black tar heroin." I listened patiently, and as soon as we were finished and they left I cried bitter tears at how cruel people can be. I heard years later that the client was doing terribly, was a prostitute, and a heavy drug user. Sometimes this field is like staring into the abyss of human suffering. This field is reaching into the abyss of human suffering and hoping you can hold onto whoever you can grab. I say this because you did more than stare into the abyss. You reached out, you tried, and you felt the filth of the abyss on yourself as you tried to pull them to safety. I'm proud of what you did. It's so hard and it's so important. I was a high school teacher and was called to counsel so many times. One time one of my students, 13F, was sexually assaulted by an adult male the night before, and her friend told me. I had to call the police, mandated reporter, and the school called mom. Mom showed up and basically told her daughter she was a slut. This was her very first sexual experience, and abandoned her. I went with her to the police station to file the report, and was in the room for the physical exam. They don't teach you these things in teacher school. My heart broke for her and I was a mess that night and day after. How could a parent do that to a child? I had a student attempt suicide by taking a bottle of her brother's medicine and then get on the bus for school. By the time she got to school, we knew something was wrong and called 911. 9 hours later, I went to the hospital to visit her and the nurse sitting in her room asked me if I was her mother because her mother hadn't shown up yet. She was in 3rd grade. I had to do a diagnostic assessment for a young female client. It was in order for her to have a diagnosis to receive psychiatric care for at the clinic I was working at. She was very sweet, seemed very friendly, innocent, yet vulnerable. And she spoke at length at being repeatedly and brutally sexually assaulted by her father and uncle growing up. Her description was told in a way that showed she had learned to normalize it, in the worst way. Like, that is just how things were. But she also told the accounts with obvious shame and guilt. I couldn't keep it together. I cried. I've usually cried after sessions if a client has shared some trauma or life experiences that have set them up for a difficult life or feelings of unworthiness. In session, I have cried more when clients share big successes or are graduating from services because they've met goals and such. One example was when a client, who struggled with discussing their struggles with mental health due to peer perception at school, wrote about their pet passing away for a writing class. In the writing, they shared about how helpful their pet was in coping with their struggles and how losing them had been very difficult. They were so afraid to submit it BC it would be the first time they shared about their mental health outside of a handful of people. 6 months later they were on a stage sharing about the same struggles to an auditorium filled with strangers. I cried during both moments. Not a therapist, but I've made my therapist cry a few times. I feel bad when it happens because I can't imagine how difficult it must be for her to hear and stay present to support me in processing. I cried after I worked with a kid who described an emotionally difficult situation with a sibling. The kid's experience aligned very similarly to something I went through with my own sibling when I was the kid's age and I hadn't realized how much hurt I was carrying from the experience. Being a therapist sometimes means being confronted with things you didn't realize had such a strong impact on you. Luckily, I have a stellar therapist of my own that I can work through these moments with. Who is the prime therapist that ends the chain of therapy? What burdens must their mind hold? As a fellow parent whose kid died, these are the only situations where I find it therapeutically beneficial to the client to 1. Disclose and 2. Cry when it feels natural. As a patient whose kid died, I'm sorry to hear you're in this shitty club too. Thank you for helping others. I originally started seeing my therapist so I could start making changes to the negative thought patterns, habits I had ignored for years. Shortly after I started with her, my partner was diagnosed with a rare cancer. She was there for the lengthy diagnosis journey, and when I had to tell her yes, it is cancer, I could see tears well up in her eyes. I'm not sure if it brought up feelings for her own personal experiences, or if it was because she felt just that emotionally invested in mine. She was very professional the entire time though. I hope your partner has recovered heart. My boyfriend is a therapist, and some days, he offers teletherapy. We both have home offices, so I don't see or hear his sessions. Confidentiality is very seriously protected. But one day, he came out of his office several minutes late, with tears in his eyes, and it was obvious he had been crying. I really wish I could ask him, but I just gave him a hug and went back into my office. The hug is what he really needed. In 3.5 years, the only time my therapist cried was when I handed her the typed and detailed account of my trauma from my ex. We had not discussed it in full-fledged detail before because I couldn't verbalize it. And it about broke me when she cried because no one in my life had ever cared that much. I actually was let go by my therapist because when I started to speak on my trauma from my ex it was too much for her. The first hard story was a lot and I'm glad she was honest, but I still haven't found the help I need because I'm afraid no one can handle what I went through. Edit. I want to thank everyone below me for the encouragement and advice. I haven't given up, but it's hard for me to open up, so it takes a while for me to get that brave again. Thank you for caring about me and my trauma. I promise I haven't given up. I just know this is a long journey and I don't want to keep taking the wrong steps. Y'all are so wonderful. Thank you. My therapist cried a little when I told her that seeing her was nearly the only thing I always look forward to. Mine cried a little when I told her she was the closest to a mother figure I had ever had.